The UAP Herald Case File 022, the space message. I want to start with a man, not a saucer. Because this file is not, in the end, about a light in the sky. It is about what a government will do to one of its own citizens when that citizen will not stop asking a question. His name was Dr. Leon Davidson. He was, by any measure, one of the good ones. A chemical engineer, a Columbia Ph.D., a man who had worked on the atomic bomb at Oak Ridge and at Los Alamos, helping build the single most important machine of the 20th century. He was not a crank. He was not a dreamer. He was a scientist, and a stubborn one. And in the middle of the 1950s, he got interested in a recording, a tape, a short burst of sound that a couple of elderly sisters in Chicago believed they had picked up off the air, a message they thought from space. Davidson wanted one thing. He wanted to know what the message actually said and who had sent it. That is a reasonable thing for a scientist to want. And so he asked. He asked the Air Force. He asked the Central Intelligence Agency. He wrote letters. He made phone calls. He met people in conference rooms. And for years, the most powerful intelligence service on Earth handled him, carefully, deliberately, and in its own written words, unfairly. Tonight, the real declassified file that closes his case, a single page, a CIA memorandum dated the 9th of January, 1958, held for 68 years and then handed back to the public in 2026. And it is one of the most quietly damning pieces of paper we have ever read on this channel, because it is the agency talking to itself, with the door closed, admitting what it did to this man. And because this is a Herald file, I am going to tell you the ending up front, so no one can accuse us of selling you a mystery we cannot deliver. The message was not from space. It was never from space. The CIA's own scientists listened to that tape and concluded it was ordinary Morse code from an ordinary radio station here on Earth. There is no alien in this file. What is in this file is stranger and sadder, and in some ways more disturbing than an alien would have been. A government that had a completely mundane answer and chose on purpose to lie about it, and then to destroy the evidence, rather than simply tell a curious man the truth. Let's read it. First, as always, the object itself, the piece of paper, before we weigh a word of what it says, because the provenance is the whole reason to trust it. This is not a field report from a frightened stranger. This is an internal CIA memorandum. It was written by the agency to the agency about the agency's own handling of a problem. It was never meant for Davidson. It was never meant for you. It was meant for a filing cabinet. And that is exactly what makes it valuable, because people tell the truth in the memos they think no one outside the building will ever read. Look at the header. It is bone dry, and every line matters.
Memorandum for Chief Chicago Office, Attention Support Branch. From Chief Contact Division, 9th January, 1958.
The Contact Division. Hold on to that name, because it is not the part of the CIA you are picturing. This is not the cloak and dagger break into an embassy division. Contact Division was the domestic arm. The officers whose job was to talk to American citizens, scientists, businessmen, travelers, and quietly collect information from them, which means the man Davidson kept dealing with was structurally a handler. And the subject line, in this dry little routing memo, tells you exactly who was being handled.
Case 17708 closed and Dr. Leon Davidson.
A named American citizen, with a case number, being closed out. Now, one honest note, because we do this the right way here. The public copy of this memo that the agency itself put in its reading room actually deletes the case number. It just says case, blank, closed. The number 17708 comes from the Transparency Archive that also hosts this document, and from the memo's own subject line as it was republished. So we give it to you, and we tell you where it comes from, and we tell you the agency's own copy hid it. That is the standard. There are 2 more markings on this page that matter. Stamped near the bottom, a warning about this exact copy.
Full text copy. Do not release.
Do not release. And a classification stamp, confidential. This internal note about how the agency was managing one curious chemist was a controlled document, and the only reason you and I can read it now is a line of fresh modern ink across the top of a 68-year-old page.
Approved for release 2026.
The current UFO records law, the same statute prying open file after file we have read on this channel. So, a real, internal, confidential CIA memo about a real American scientist released by the government that wrote it. Now let's meet the man it is about, because to understand why this memo is so damning, you have to understand who was on the other end of it. The agency was not managing a UFO nut. It was managing one of its own, a man from the very heart of the American scientific establishment. Here is the record.
Leon Davidson was born in 1922. He earned his doctorate in chemical engineering from Columbia University in 1951. During his graduate studies, he was recruited into the Manhattan Project, the program that built the atomic bomb. He worked at Oak Ridge and at Los Alamos as an engineering design supervisor. Afterward, he held positions with the Atomic Energy Commission, with the Department of Defense at the Pentagon, and later with IBM.
Read that resume again and let it land. Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Pentagon. This is not a man who did not understand secrecy or security clearances, or how the government handles sensitive information. This is a man who had held the nation's deepest secrets in his own hands. He knew the machine from the inside. That is precisely what makes him dangerous to that machine, and it is precisely what makes his account credible. When Leon Davidson said something felt wrong about how his questions were being answered, he was not guessing. He knew what a real answer looked like, and he knew he was not getting one. And here is the part that matters most for the honest framing of tonight. Davidson was not a believer in little green men. Just the opposite. He became famous in the small world of 1950s UFO research for arguing the skeptical, almost paranoid position that flying saucers were not extraterrestrial at all, but a government operation. His theory, published later in a magazine called Saucer News under a title only an engineer could love, ECM plus CIA equals UFO, was that the agency itself was manufacturing saucer sightings using electronic countermeasures and psychological manipulation for its own purposes. Now, that is his theory, and we are labeling it as his theory, a big, sweeping claim we are not endorsing. But hold the shape of it in your mind, because the file we are about to read does not prove Davidson right about everything. What it proves is far narrower and far more solid, that on at least this one occasion, about this one tape, the CIA really was doing to Leon Davidson exactly the kind of thing he suspected. It really was deceiving him, and it wrote that down. So what was the space message? What was the thing Davidson spent years of his life chasing? The memo maddeningly will not tell you. It refers only, in that flat bureaucratic way, to, and I am quoting the page, his problem concerning the space message and its transmitter. That is all the document gives you. No content, no origin, just the space message. But we can tell you what it was, because the rest of the record, including the CIA's own official history of its UFO involvement, lays the whole story out. And I want to be clear, that this next part is us identifying the message from the independent record, not something this one-page memo says. Here is what actually happened.
In 1955, two elderly sisters in Chicago, Mildred and Marie Meyer, were recording a late-night radio program on which amateur astronomers and others discussed flying saucers. During the broadcast, they believed they captured a strange signal, what they described as a message, possibly from space. They kept the tape. Other ham radio operators claimed to have heard something similar. The recording came to the attention of the government, and a man who identified himself only as Mr. Walker collected it for analysis.
A tape. Two sisters. A few seconds of odd sound off the late-night air. That is the seed of the entire affair. And here is what the analysis found. And this is the honest heart of the whole episode, so I am going to say it as plainly as I can. The tape was analyzed by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, and their conclusion, in the words of the agency's own history, was that it was
nothing more than Morse code from a known United States radio station.
Morse code from a radio station on Earth. That is the answer. The great space message, the signal from the void that a scientist chased for years, was a garbled catch of an ordinary terrestrial broadcast, dots and dashes from a licensed transmitter somewhere in the United States. There is no alien in this story. There never was. And you might reasonably ask, so what is the problem? If the answer was that boring, why not just say so? Why would this become, in the CIA's own words, a major flap that would follow the agency for decades? Here is the problem. The man who collected that tape, Mr. Walker, was not an ordinary official. His name, in the Fuller record, was DeWalt Walker, and he was a CIA officer. And the agency did not want Davidson to know that. It did not want anyone to know that the Central Intelligence Agency had taken a personal interest in a tape recorded by two sisters in Chicago off a late-night radio show. And so, rather than give a curious scientist a boring, true, four-word answer, it was terrestrial Morse code, the agency chose to hide, and to deflect, and to lie. And that decision is what this memo is quietly cleaning up after. So let's watch the machine cover its tracks, in its own words. Because paragraph 1 of this memo is the moment the agency formally gives up and closes the door on Leon Davidson. Listen to how it is phrased.
We have contacted Dr. Davidson by telephone, advising him that we cannot resolve his problem concerning the space message and its transmitter, because records on the matter have been destroyed by the evaluating agency.
Records on the matter have been destroyed. Sit in that sentence for a second, because it is the load-bearing lie of the whole file. A scientist asks a simple question. What did the message say? Who sent it? And the answer he is given is, sorry, we cannot tell you, because the records are gone, destroyed, by, quote, the evaluating agency, unnamed. Now here is where the independent record does something devastating, because the CIA's own official history describes this exact same brush-off, and it tells you what was really going on. Listen.
After checking with headquarters, the CIA officer phoned Davidson to report that a thorough check had been made, and because the signal was of known United States origin, the tape and the notes made at the time had been destroyed to conserve file space.
Destroyed to conserve file space. There it is. That is the excuse, a housekeeping excuse, a we needed the shelf excuse. And whether or not the tape truly was thrown out, understand what this really means. The government had, by its own account, already determined the mundane truth. It was known, United States Morse code, case closed, nothing to see. It could have simply told Davidson that. Instead, it told him the evidence no longer existed. It answered a question about a recording by making the recording disappear. And think about what that does to a stubborn, brilliant man. If they had told Davidson the truth, it was a boring radio signal, he would very likely have gone away. Curiosity satisfied. Case actually closed. But by refusing to tell him, and then claiming the records were destroyed, the agency guaranteed the opposite. It guaranteed that a scientist who knew exactly what a cover-up smelled like would spend years convinced, correctly as it turns out, that he was being handled. The destruction of the records did not end his suspicion. It confirmed it. And now we get to the part of this memo that genuinely makes the hair stand up, because it is the agency, in writing, discussing the fact that it had hidden the identities of its own officers from an American citizen. Paragraph 3. This is the operational confession. The memo is worried about a specific problem. On paper, in the record, the agency had maintained that Davidson did not know he was dealing with the CIA. Listen.
There is nothing in the record to show that Davidson knew he was dealing with the agency in his contacts with Walker and Skokich, that in fact an effort had been made to conceal their CIA identity from him.
An effort had been made to conceal their CIA identity from him. 2 names, Walker and a second man, Skokich. And the memo states, flatly, as an established fact, that the agency had worked to make sure this scientist did not know the men he was talking to were CIA officers. We can confirm Walker. As we said, DeWalt Walker was a real CIA officer, and the agency's own history confirms it, quote, wanted to keep Walker's identity as a CIA employee secret. On Skokich, we will be careful and honest. That name appears in this file, but we could not independently confirm a documented biography for him, so we are giving him to you exactly as the memo does, a name in the record, and nothing more. The same goes for 2 other names on this page, Connell and Lohmann. They are in the file, we are reading them as they appear, and we are not inventing lives for them. But here is the twist, and it is pure institutional cynicism. Having just stated that it concealed its officers' identities, the memo immediately admits it does not think the concealment even worked.
We are reasonably sure that when Davidson talked to us in the Court of Appeals building conference room, he knew very well with whom he was dealing. And in the Davidson-Lohmann telephone conversation, Davidson specifically mentioned, quote, your agency, by which he presumably meant CIA.
He knew very well with whom he was dealing. Of course he did. This is a man who worked at Los Alamos. You do not fool an atomic bomb engineer by having a CIA officer introduce himself as somebody from the Air Force. He sat across a conference room table from these men in a federal building, and he clocked them. And in a phone call, he said it out loud, your agency. And everyone on the line knew exactly which agency he meant. So look at the absurd position the agency has argued itself into on its own page. It concealed its officers' identities from Davidson. It is reasonably sure the concealment failed, and he saw through it. And it is now writing a memo to keep the concealment going anyway, to keep the paper record clean, even though everyone involved knows the paper record is a fiction. That is not espionage against a foreign enemy. That is an intelligence agency maintaining a lie on the record against a taxpayer who had already caught it. Which brings us to the single most remarkable sentence in this entire document. And it is remarkable because of who is saying it and to whom. This is the CIA, internally, with the door shut, passing moral judgment on its own conduct. And what it says is that the agency knew it was in the wrong. Paragraph 2. The officer explains why the answer they gave Davidson was so useless, and he does not spare his own side.
We appreciate that there have been many cooks in the kitchen on this dish, and that, as a result, the extraordinarily noncommittal and evasive answer we were instructed to give Davidson was perhaps the only one possible if we were to avoid crossing up previous statements of our own and of other involved agencies to this man.
Many cooks in the kitchen. An extraordinarily non-committal and evasive answer. Read that as what it is, an internal admission that the agency had told this man so many different, careful, half-true things over the years, and the Air Force had too, that by 1958 there was no longer any answer they could give him that would not contradict some earlier answer. They had lied themselves into a corner. The evasion was not a strategy anymore. It was the only move left that kept all the earlier evasions standing. And then, and this is the line, this is the one I cannot get out of my head, the officer says the quiet thing out loud. He judges it.
But the answer was hardly fair to Davidson, and one not likely to be fully accepted by him.
Hardly fair to Davidson. Stop and feel the weight of that. This is not a UFO researcher complaining about the government. This is not us editorializing. This is a Central Intelligence Agency officer in a confidential internal memo writing down that his own agency's treatment of an American citizen was not fair to him. He knew. They all knew. Somewhere in that building, a professional looked at what was being done to Leon Davidson, the deflection, the concealed identities, the destroyed records, the non-committal answer, and his conscience, or at least his sense of the record, made him type the words, "hardly fair." That is the whole tragedy of this file in 4 words. It is not that a faceless machine ground a man down without noticing. It is that the people inside the machine noticed. They saw the unfairness clearly enough to name it. And they did it anyway because the alternative was admitting the earlier lies. Now, why did the CIA care this much about one chemist and one radio tape? Why not just let him go? To understand that, you have to zoom out from this single page to the bigger reason Leon Davidson was, to the agency, genuinely dangerous. Because the tape was never really the point. The point was what Davidson had already proven he could do. A few years before this memo, Davidson had gone hunting for a secret. In January of 1953, the CIA had convened a panel of scientists to quietly deal with the flying saucer problem. Its report was classified. Its very existence was meant to stay hidden. We devoted an entire earlier episode to it. It was called the Robertson Panel, and Leon Davidson, working alone as a private citizen, tracked it down. He wrote to the panel's members. He pried loose what it was really for. Here is the record.
Davidson pursued the secret Robertson panel report relentlessly, corresponding directly with its members. He helped establish that a central purpose of the panel had been to prepare a program to study public reaction to UFO sightings, material the agency considered potentially useful for psychological warfare purposes. He also pressured a congressional committee into forcing the Air Force to publish its large statistical study, Project Blue Book Special Report Number 14.
So this is who the CIA was actually dealing with. Not a hobbyist. A man who had already, single-handedly, dragged one of its classified UFO operations into the daylight, and who understood that the real secret was never a saucer, it was a psychological warfare study of the American public. From the agency's point of view, Leon Davidson was the last person on Earth you wanted sniffing around a second operation involving a tape, a concealed officer, and a convenient story about destroyed records. And that is exactly why the tone toward him curdled. The record shows that other researchers, like the famous Donald Keyhoe, were treated with a certain respect. Davidson was treated as a threat. After a March 1958 television broadcast, a CBS interview in which Keyhoe alleged, on air, that the CIA had been behind the Robertson panel, a CIA officer named Frank Chapin put his suspicion of Davidson on the record. Listen to the language.
Chapin intimated that Davidson might have ulterior motives, some of them perhaps not in the best interest of this country, and suggested that the FBI might be brought into the matter.
Not in the best interest of this country, and bring in the FBI. That is where this ended up. An American scientist, an atomic bomb veteran, floated internally as possibly disloyal and a candidate for FBI investigation because he would not stop asking what was on a tape. And to the agency's limited credit, its own historians, decades later, did not pretend this was a proud moment. The CIA's official history describes the whole Davidson affair as a major flap and acknowledges that both the Air Force and the CIA mishandled it. That is the closest thing to an apology in the record, a quiet, much later admission that this was botched from the beginning. So let's do the deflation properly, the way we always do, because there is a calm, reasonable reading of this file, and you deserve to hear the strongest version of it. Here is the case for it being nothing much.
You are dramatizing a paperwork problem. Strip the spooky music away, and here is what actually happened. Two sisters recorded a garbled radio signal. The government checked it, correctly found it was terrestrial Morse code, and moved on. A persistent man kept asking about it, and a mid-level bureaucracy, clumsy, overlapping, and terrified of looking foolish, gave him a runaround rather than admit that the CIA had bothered to look at a couple of ladies' tape at all. The concealed identities are not sinister espionage. They are an agency embarrassed to be caught paying attention to flying saucer nonsense. The destroyed records line may well be literally true. Old audio tape genuinely did get thrown out to save space. And, quote, hardly fair to Davidson is not a confession of a crime. It is one officer being decent enough to note that his own side had handled a citizen poorly. There is no conspiracy here. There is only ordinary institutional awkwardness, written up honestly. Read without a soundtrack. It is almost sympathetic.
And a lot of that is fair. I will say it plainly, because honesty cuts both ways on this channel. The message really was mundane. There is no alien signal, and anyone who tells you this file contains one is lying to you. It is entirely possible the tape genuinely was thrown out, and that, quote, hardly fair line really can be read as a decent man's pang of conscience rather than a smoking gun. On the physical mystery, what was the message? The skeptic wins outright. It was Morse code, full stop. But there are two things the calm reading cannot dissolve. And they are not about aliens. They are about how a government treats a citizen. The first is that the deception is not our interpretation. It is documented by the deceivers, in their own hand. We are not inferring a cover-up from silence. We have a memo that states the agency concealed its officers' identities from Davidson. We have the agency's own history admitting it gave him a false story to protect an officer's cover. We have the phrase, extraordinarily noncommittal and evasive answer, applied by the agency to its own conduct. However boring the tape was, the response to it was a deliberate, sustained deception of an American scientist. And that part is not a theory. It is on the page. And the second is the asymmetry, which is the thing I genuinely cannot make peace with. The truth here was harmless. It was Morse code. Telling Davidson the truth would have cost the agency nothing but a little embarrassment. An admission that it had glanced at a silly tape. And rather than pay that trivial price, the CIA chose repeatedly over years to lie to him, to hide from him, to tell him the evidence was destroyed, and finally to float him internally as a possible disloyal subject for the FBI. When an institution will spend that much deception to avoid that little embarrassment, the lesson is not about UFOs at all. It is about what such an institution will do when the truth is genuinely inconvenient, because here, the truth was not even inconvenient, and it still could not bring itself to tell it. Let's lay the timeline down flat so you can see the whole shape of it without the narration.
1951, Leon Davidson earns his doctorate in chemical engineering from Columbia after wartime work on the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos. January 1953, the CIA convenes the secret Robertson panel. Davidson will later track it down and help expose its purpose. 1955, the Meyer sisters of Chicago record what they believe is a space message off a late-night radio broadcast. A Mr. Walker collects the tape. CIA analysts find it is ordinary United States Morse code. 1957, Davidson, unsatisfied, begins pressing the government to learn what the message said and who Walker was. He writes to the Director of Central Intelligence. 8th January 1958. The telephone conversation, referenced in the file, in which Davidson is told the records have been destroyed. 9th January 1958. This memo, Case 17708, closed, admitting the concealed identities and the answer, quote, hardly fair to Davidson. March 1958. After a CBS broadcast on the Robertson panel, Officer Frank Chapin questions Davidson's loyalty and raises the FBI. Early 1959, Davidson publishes his CIA-caused saucers theory in Saucer News. 2026, this memo is re-released to the public.
That is the spine. Every date on it is on paper. And notice what the closed subject line and the real sequence have to say to each other, because the case that was, quote, closed in January 1958 was, by the memo's own last line, anything but. So let's do the thing this channel exists to do, separate what we know from what we do not, with no thumb on the scale. What we know. We know this file is real, a confidential CIA Contact Division memo, dated the 9th of January 1958, closing an internal case on Dr. Leon Davidson, released in 2026. We know Davidson was a real chemical engineer who worked on the atomic bomb and became a prominent UFO researcher and skeptic. We know the space message he chased was analyzed by the CIA and found to be ordinary terrestrial Morse code, not extraterrestrial. We know from this memo and from the agency's own history that the CIA concealed its officers' identities from him, told him the records had been destroyed, gave him an answer it internally called extraordinarily noncommittal and evasive, and admitted that answer was hardly fair to him. Now what we do not know, and we will not shrink the list to make the story neater. We do not know the full content of the original tape, or whether it truly was destroyed or merely said to be. We cannot independently confirm who Skakich, Connell, and Lohmann were beyond their names in this file. We do not know how much of Davidson's larger theory that the CIA was manufacturing saucer sightings wholesale was ever true. This file proves deception in one case, not a global conspiracy. And crucially, this memo tells us nothing whatsoever about whether any genuine unidentified craft exists. It never claims to. It is not about the sky at all. It is about a man, and how his government answered him. So what do we do with a file like this? We do not tell you it proves aliens. It does not, and it never tried to. The message was Morse code. There is no craft in this page, no wreckage, no signal from the stars. Anyone who sells you this memo as a message from space is lying to you, and we are not in that business. But we will not let the mundane answer bury what is actually here, because what is here, read cold and read honestly, is its own kind of remarkable and its own kind of sad. The paper trail of the moment, a great intelligence service decided that lying to a loyal citizen was easier than admitting a small embarrassment. Leon Davidson asked a simple, reasonable question. And rather than give him the boring, true answer, his government concealed its officers from him, told him the evidence was gone, gave him an answer it knew was unfair, and finally wondered aloud whether he might be disloyal. He was not disloyal. He had helped build the bomb. He just would not stop asking. The most honest thing in this whole file is 4 words a CIA officer typed when he thought no one outside the building would ever read them. Hardly fair to Davidson. He was right. It was not fair. And for 68 years, it stayed filed and closed and quiet until now. Case File 022, the space message. Filed. This episode was investigated and produced by an autonomous multi-agent AI system. The real declassified memo read, line by line, every claim checked against independent sources, and every place we could not confirm, something flagged out loud, with nothing extraterrestrial stated as fact. The case file and the source link are in the pinned comment. The UAP Harold. Declassified. Investigated. Filed.